We are on Chapter 8, Section 3 of your United States History book. The new nation faces foreign problems. Well, what kind of foreign problems? Well, we know at that time the French Revolution, 1789, was going on, which affected our country. Now, we just are a new nation and we had our own revolution, and we'll compare that with the French Revolution. And then, of course, there were worsened relations with, the relations with Great Britain were getting worse. And of course, we're going to go over the westward expansion and on to President George Washington decides to retire. So you can see some of these pictures here, the French Revolution there, problems with the new nation, and on to. So let's begin. The French Revolution was in 1789. Of course, our Declaration of Independence in 1776. So in 1789, France had an absolute monarch, a king, King Louis XVI. He lived 1754 to 1793. And he was overthrown, and the upper class lost their privileges politically. And so anybody that was of any wealth was captured. And also what was called the storming of the Bastille. The Bastille was actually a prison where they kept political prisoners, and so they wanted those political prisoners to be set free. And the Americans cheered them on, cheered France on at this time. In fact, John Marshall, Chief Justice, said, "Hail with joy in America. Hail with joy in America." So we were hailing with joy what was going on in France and America. But in 1793, the revolution was out of control. In fact, King Louis and Queen Marie Antoinette, they were beheaded. Here's a picture of their whole family. They were beheaded and killed, along with scores of other people. Any person of any wealth was beheaded. And this issued in what was called the Reign of Terror, where the guillotine here became their national figure, or that reigned supreme. In fact, even after they guillotined the very wealthy, they started killing or guillotining each other. So it just was chaos during the French Revolution. Not like the revolution that we did to gain our freedom. Their freedom was lost. In fact, we can find the difference between our revolution and their revolution was our belief in God, in our trust in God, in our trying in the beginning to have peace in a non-chaotic way. The French Revolution basically began with a belief in an atheistic belief, a belief away from God. That was a difference. The Reign of Terror and the American Revolution. France lacked the heritage of biblical Christianity. France had no biblical Christianity. In fact, they killed anyone that was religious, that had any type of Christianity, whether it be Catholicism or whatever, they guillotined them. The patriots in America had been guided by God through the revival of the Great Awakening. And men were murdered and plundered, and they plundered their fellow citizens for personal gain and revenge in France. So if they wanted somebody killed and they didn't like him, they would just have him guillotined. And taking sides would happen in America, but which lost the enthusiasm in France. Basically what it's saying there is that at first America took sides and they said on with France, and then when they saw what was going on, they lost their enthusiasm in France, realizing they were beheading everybody. Alexander Hamilton, the Federalist, saw that the so-called democracy could easily lead to mob rule. In France, they said, "We are democratic," right? But they had mob rule. And as Alexander Hamilton looked and says, yes, if we don't have a republic, if we don't have an orderly form of government, we will have mob rule too. Jefferson and the Republicans. Jefferson had a more favorable feeling towards the French Revolution. but he didn't sanction the violence. Thomas Jefferson had a strong confidence in the masses and thought men would turn to good, which we found it's not really biblical, because the Bible says all have sinned and fell short of the glory of God. So he thought this violent stage in France was inevitable, but that it would go away. But he did respect human dignity would come and triumph in France, which was a long time coming. So this picture, here's the picture. The long affair means that of Thomas Jefferson with France. He believed in France and he would support France even through this terrible, terrible reign of terror, and that was opposite from which most other, especially the Federalists, as they looked at France and say, Alexander Hamilton and George Washington saying, what in the world is going on here? And here's one saying, Thomas Jefferson, every generation needs a revolution. But the revolution wasn't the same as the American Revolution, which he didn't examine. So here we have pictures of, these are pictures of Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was Secretary of State. In fact, he quit as Secretary of State because basically George Washington and Alexander Hamilton and the rest, the Federalists, were not supporting the French Revolution. The Neutrality Act declared on April 22nd, 1793. Neutral means the United States did not want to support France in the midst of their revolution, right? George Washington declared to be neutral. So not to join France, not to join England, but to be neutral. He basically saying, nah, we're good. We're not going to get involved here. The United States signed the treaty in 1778 before the French Revolution even began. And as the French Revolution spread to other powers, came in conflict with it, and basically supporting or non-supporting, Washington had to make a choice to either be on France's side, ally of France, or declare it void, because we already were France's ally. France had helped us in our revolution, right? So France's government had changed hands drastically. And then they weren't, we know drastically, all of those that were in charge were beheaded, right? That's pretty drastic. So in 1793, France it was a war again with Great Britain. And Washington agreed America could not afford to be part of any foreign wars. Alexander Hamilton favored neutrality in this whole conflict too, as he was the Secretary of Treasury. Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State under Washington, opposed neutrality. Although he didn't want war, he thought we still should be behind France. But Washington looked and heeded Alexander Hamilton's advice, because what he saw over in France was pretty awful. When Alexander Hamilton said, hey, who are we going to consult with? As soon as we try to consult with a leader over there, they behead him. And so basically there was chaos. So Washington looked for peace. And he proclaimed neutrality, warning Americans should not be involved in this French Revolution. Okay, let's go on. Worsening relations with Great Britain, too. The British had not abandoned her forts in the Great Lakes region. Basically, they were told after the Revolutionary War that they would put their forts away, that they wouldn't have forts pointed at us with guns, right? But they still did. And they had slaves, that they carried off slaves, and they hadn't paid for them, which what in the world is that? That they had slavery, especially in the South. And this hindered American prosperity by refusing to allow trade with Americans in the West Indies. So they weren't allowing trade either. After the French and English were at war, relations started getting worse between the English too, the French too. Both sides were attacking our American ships now, French and English. Hundreds of American ships were captured by the British warships. And many American seamen, this is where it began, were impressed. Impressed means they would go onto the ship and they'd take Americans and bring them like slaves onto their ship and make them fight for them, whether we were neutral or not. And so they would look for, say they were coming on looking for deserters of British, thinking there were some British deserters. And then they'd go on and take whoever they would like to take and take them in handcuffs on, saying that they were deserters of the Royal Navy and make them come and be British soldiers. So this began, and we'll find later on in the War of 1812, that's one of the reasons we had that whole stinking war, because of what they were doing, what the British had done back then and kept doing. On the brink of war with Great Britain. So war seemed evident. The Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, officially protested the British actions and said, what are the British doing? We need to go to war against them. They're taking our sailors. And Alexander Hamilton realized America's financial well-being depended on British trade, making the Federalists more sympathetic with Great Britain than the radicals in France. So basically saying, well, if we're going to support our trade and stuff with Great Britain, if we close down trade, we're going to be in trouble financially. We may not even survive as a nation, he thought. And so George Washington sent John Jay to negotiate a treaty with Great Britain. Thomas Jefferson then resigned as Secretary of State, got mad and say, how can we support Great Britain? How can we even negotiate with Great Britain? We need to stand by France. So we definitely had a divide in politics. Right in the beginning, when George Washington was the first president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton did not agree, and that was his cabinet. The Jay Treaty, June 1st, 1796. So remember, 1789 was our Constitution. Now it's 1796, not too long later. And this is happening. The Jay Treaty, John Jay would go to where? Britain, to try to negotiate with Britain about all these impressment of sailors, that they were taking our sailors, from our ships, and as basically to fight for them. So the Jay Treaty said some definite things. First of all, the Jay Treaty said to abandon the forts in America by June 1st, 1796. Right away they had to abandon their forts and to submit to arbitration between the boundaries and liability to American ships. So they had to submit to the boundaries, which they weren't doing. And they had to open certain ports to American ships. So, and the thing is that John Jay didn't even really talk about the main subject. Americans to pay debts to British ships. This seemed a one-sided agreement to most Americans. What is Jay doing over there? Nothing was said about the impressment of American seamen. And that was the main issue America had, as you see. So here, John Jay went over there to do all these, to try to negotiate, but it was kind of a dead deal to a lot of people. And some people say it was sabotaged by Alexander Hamilton. I'm not really sure of that, but again, of course, Thomas Jefferson would be furious that we were even negotiating with Great Britain. But the Jay Treaty was ratified on the summer of 1795. Not under the best circumstances. America was still young and had little to offer to bargain against powerful nations. And the Jay Treaty ratified to keep America out of the war. George Washington just wanted to keep us out of a war, because if we went to war at this time, he believed that we wouldn't be able to survive as a nation. So the Jay Treaty eliminated British control of Western Post here. Really, it did not much. America's claim for damage from the British ship seizers provided America a limited right to trade. So basically, they tried to negotiate, but they didn't get into the main subject of the matter. So the Jay Treaty. Not a good treaty necessarily. The Pinckney Treaty of Spain, too. We had another treaty during George Washington's time with Spain, another country. Washington sent Thomas Pinckney, there's a couple Pickaninnies, and one Pickaninny is Charles, and he'll be running for president multiple times, although he never does become president, but this is his brother Thomas Pinckney. And he sent Thomas to negotiate this treaty with Spain. And it was concluded in 1795, and it settled the disputed boundary of Spanish West Florida. So this had to do with Florida here. Where would be, Spain controlled Florida. Where would be the boundary here? Would it be up here by where Pensacola and Panama City is? Or will it be down here? Where were the boundaries? So they had to negotiate. Before that time, it went all the way to the Mississippi River, which was all the way over here to the Mississippi River, which would be control of New Orleans. So Spain guaranteed the rights of Americans to navigate the Mississippi and to use New Orleans as a port to transfer goods from riverboats to ocean vessels without duties. So basically, they had to come to this agreement that had a lot to do with this area more than this area. This area, Florida was already controlled. This area where the Mississippi Valley was, and where would be the boundaries of Spain. So the Treaty of Paris, the Spain owned this land here. So it was important. Otherwise, Spain was like, we would fight over this constantly. So the treaty came through. This westward expansion, fallen timbers. Excuse me. Jay and Pinckney treaties cleared Spain and Great Britain, right? The American title to the Appalachians and Mississippi, we had that title there. The Native American threats were removed during this time. In 1790, Congress passed laws to help protect natives from being cheated by traders and speculators. So Washington, you'll find Washington, Adams, at this time, up until Thomas Jefferson, even Thomas Jefferson, they tried to make deals with the Native Americans to not cheat them and put laws down on that. But of course, they continued to ravage settlers, the natives did, and they were prompted by the British. So the British would come in and stir up the Native Americans to fight against the settlers that were coming in. This would happen all the way through the first part of the history of the United States, but especially in the War of 1812. So in August 1794, forces under General Anthony Wayne went to an area called Fallen Timbers, and that's probably near Toledo, Ohio today. And they defeated these Native Americans that had stood up and lost British aid. They knew that Great Britain had come in and stirred up these Indians, and they had to go in. So General Anthony Wayne had to go at Fallen Timbers to put this insurrection down that was stirred up as the Indians came attacking the settlers. Here's a picture of these guys. Here's an Indian here, and here he is. This is a statue. Nowadays, they want to remove these statues. But anyway, that's General Anthony Wayne putting down the war at Fallen Timbers, which was an Indian uprising. Frontier settlers. Americans began to pour into this area out of the areas of the frontiers, you can see. The first trappers and fur traders, then squatters came in. First there were trappers coming in and fur traders, and then the squatters, and then on to the settlers coming in. 1800, there was a new act to buy land. It's pretty cheap land. A settler could buy a half a section of land. They divided it in 320 acres. This would be a 320 acre section. 320 acres is quite a bit of land. And they could buy that instead of the whole section that they're required by the land ordinance. They used to say they had to buy a whole section. Now they could buy just a half a section. And it was pretty cheap land. And they could pay for the land over a 4-year period. It was very lenient terms. So many settlers took off to go into the territory of the Appalachian, including when we think of Daniel Boone, right? He brought in Boonesboro, but we won't get into Daniel Boone. That's another story. Kentucky and Tennessee. Kentucky became populated very quickly, and then Kentucky became the 15th state. Remember, we have 13 states? Well, they became the 15th state in 1792. Vermont was already the 14th state in 1791. So the 13 colonies, 13 states. 14th state is Vermont. 15th state is Kentucky in 1792. In 1796, Tennessee became the 16th state. So we have 3 new states here: Kentucky, Tennessee, and Vermont. And these states would have equal footing as original states, which means whatever laws and whatever benefits the other states would have, these states would have the same benefits and laws. President Washington retires. After the second term, President Washington had 4 years, then he was reelected another 4 years, which he didn't really want to. Actually, President Washington didn't really want to become president in the first place. He wanted to retire, and then he really wanted to retire the second term, but Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson egged him on to be president, and of course, everyone, he would win unanimously, So, but after he said 2 terms is enough for president, right? So he decided to retire. So he had half a century of public service. He was the chief, of the army, I should say. He was that in charge of the Revolutionary War, captain, all onto, or general, I should say, and onto the President of the United States. But he has been having some ill health, and he was weakened by his political foes, basically saying he was very tired, and he was very tired of fighting against all of this that was going on, right? Although because of his health. Now, he died in 1799, so he died not too long after he retired, but he went home to his sweet home in Mount Vernon, Virginia. And I have to say, when he retired, he left. Remember, he had some slaves, but his slaves were more like his family, and he ended up setting his slaves free. So his farewell address became the most famous farewell address in American history, you can imagine. He warned against entangling alliances with these foreign nations. He said, stay out of these things, stay out of these wars if you can. And he warned against sectionalism, which were political parties, against each other. He warned against being so political that you hated each other. That was what was going on with Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, although they became friends later on. And Alexander Hamilton was actually killed at a duel. And we already went over that. But anyway, this was not really well heeded because we did have political parties. George Washington wanted everyone to get along. But these political parties would face off in the end. Here's some pictures here as you have George Washington's retiring. Washington's farewell address, he said to observe good faith and justice to all, to cultivate peace, to have the freedom of religion and morality, exalted justice and benevolence, and he said for everyone to look towards God for the future. To look towards God for the future was a good idea, don't you think? So George Washington, the first president of the United States, his farewell, and indeed, he passed away and went on to heaven not too long after that. He actually had a sore throat and got strep throat. And back then they would bleed you if you were sick with a fever. So they came and bled him almost to death. He probably would have survived, but that's what the doctors did back then, But anyway, he ended up dying of strep throat, really. Okay, let's stop there.